Ladies, gentlemen, and rogues of all ages, yesterday I hit level 100. It's faster than it's ever been, and through leveling mainly with infernal hordes and nightmare dungeons, once they were available, my important Paragon glyphs were already also level 15, and I had tons and tons of gear to sift through to make my build stronger and stronger as I went. It has just never been easier to actually get a build functioning properly online, and it feels genuinely quite good to do so, but today we are here to talk about a specific build for Rogue, because now that I've hit level 100, it's the right time to talk about the advanced version of my leveling build from a few days ago, which I used and adapted for higher end gameplay and gear as I leveled the whole way through. And so this, like that, is a cold imbuement Barrage style build with some neat little additions from Season 5 itself, as well as just adjustments made to reflect certain little issues that are going on right now, and then we just sort of make this one of the simply best high-end builds for Rogue, especially compared to how easy it is to actually get it online to begin with, which makes it an exceptionally good build to use early on for farming, even for other builds that interest you as well. That said, on the note of Season 5 issues, a good example is that you could absolutely argue that the use of the new Umbra Crux rogue-specific dagger unique on a good roll is actually really good with the setup, as this lets you take advantage of Barrage actually having higher damage on ricochets than on the initial hit with our legendary aspects, which makes it much better for bosses at the very least than this version is, but that unique is currently disabled at the time of this video releasing for an undisclosed amount of time, and so of course you definitely don't want to equip it with the effect being inactive. So instead we use a different unique dagger that has actually seen a massive buff this season. That said, let's dive into the setup that we use and how it works, and how it all stacks together, starting off with the actual advanced version of this skill tree, which is of course changed from the leveling version of the build once you get some specific legendary aspects running that make it function better. And then we'll talk about specialization before jumping over to our legendaries and uniques for this setup, followed by the stats that you want to aim for, and then your tempering choices as well. Then finally we'll go through the full Paragon board setup that I have up and running, specifically set in the order that I progressed it while leveling so that you know how to do it along the way. Then just a bit of how to play this build from my time playing it so far this season. Starting off then we have your basic skill, which is going to be puncture, and we also take enhanced puncture as well as fundamental puncture. This functions very well with combo points, which, spoiler, is going to be our specialization. It regularly applies vulnerable, and it has its own unique attack speed that makes it generally better than most basic skills, especially for a build like this that functions extremely well off high numbers of hits. Then we pick our core skill for this, which is going to be Barrage, as well as its enhancement to make the ricochet chance go up to 100% against vulnerable enemies or when critting with it, and Advanced Barrage, which gives you 20% bonus crit chance with Barrage if its most recent cast ricocheted at least 4 times, which is exceptionally easy to force, especially with the enhancement that comes before this, honestly. Letting our build sort of focus more on crit damage than crit chance itself, because we get a lot of passive crit chance from our skill tree. We also, of course, will be bumping it up to the full 5 ranks for this skill, and any bonus ranks that you can get on your items for this are ideal to find as well, as this is our main damage engine. Then we're going to be taking 3 ranks of the Sturdy passive for bonus damage reduction from close enemies, as we do spend a lot of time up close, considering it is a marksman style build. It is actually still basically shotgun range, as Barrage just does its best when you use it right in front of your enemy. Then we're going to also be grabbing 3 ranks of Siphoning Strikes, which gives you an 85% lucky hit chance when critting to heal 3% of our maximum life back. And we crit a lot and hit a lot, so this is just quite a fair amount of regen when actively attacking your enemies. Moving on to the Agility cluster of skills, then we're going to be taking Shadow Step as our main movement tool, as well as a source of Unstoppable to help break out of crowd control. We grab its enhancement as well to make it apply daze and vulnerable to enemies, and then Disciplined Shadow Step, which also makes it stun enemies while reducing the skill's cooldown by 3 seconds. This combos just extremely well with our passives in this cluster too, specifically 3 ranks of Unstable Elixirs. This makes it so that your potions will actually stun enemies that are nearby you when you use them, and it will also give you a notable damage boost for 10 seconds after you drink a potion, turning your healing into a potential damage buff in a sort of fun risk-reward type of addition to the build. And most importantly, also 3 ranks of Trick Attacks, which increases both your crit chance and crit damage by a 6% multiplier per stack, up to 6 stacks for 36% total bonus. However, unlike what the tooltip says here, there's actually a fun little bug possibly going on with this, where each stack of this is multiplicative with itself. So it is 6%, which is then multiplied by 1.06, and it does that on repeat and on repeat for each stack, with the full stacked multiplier actually ending up being around 41% rather than the 36% that it says on the tooltip, which makes this passive far better than it already may have seemed, because that's quite good. Then we're going to be grabbing Caltrops as well as a trap skill, and this is pretty much in any high-end rogue build these days after they changed it and buffed it with enhanced Caltrops applying a growing debuff on an enemy that makes them take more damage from you the longer that they're standing in the radius. Then disciplined Caltrops giving us 20% bonus crit chance against enemies inside of the trap due to us having constant vulnerable application and getting the double bonus consistently. That said, that's 20% crit chance from this, 20% from Barrage's enhancement. It'll just keep getting better as we go to give us a lot of free crit chance. Then we're going to be grabbing 3 ranks of the Weapon Mastery passive as well, which gives us an extra 12% bonus damage against vulnerable enemies because we're using a bow within this build, and so this is just a nice damage bump for 3 skill points. Then we're going to be moving on to the Subterfuge cluster in our skill tree, and here we're going to be grabbing Dark Shroud, which has the fun position within this build of actually not being on our skill bar. We trigger Dark Shroud passively, solely through the Umbrous legendary aspect, which gives you lucky hit chance on crit to spawn a free shadow. Again, we crit and hit often to the point that you will most likely just have the full shades once combat has begun, even in just a couple of casts. We take its enhancements as well for bonus movement speed and chance for shadows not to be consumed, and then you have a slight choice. If you're going against enemies that are weak enough to not threaten you in the slightest, or against things that one-shot you, I guess, also, then you might as well take Countering Dark Shroud, which is a bonus 10% crit chance when you have at least 1 Dark Shroud shadow active. But if you are dying to enemies in any way that isn't a one-shot, if it's something that you could recover from, you could heal from, then you instead want Subverting Dark Shroud. This gives you 10% health restored every time a shadow is consumed. We generate shadows extremely quickly through our legendary aspect. It's so fast, in fact, that every time one goes away, it's pretty much immediately replaced. So this is just a really constant and hefty source of healing within the build should you need it. And I found that it just let me push more rewarding content earlier in my leveling journey, doing tier 4 hordes and high tier nightmare dungeons for faster XP gain and faster glyph XP gain because the damage was already more than good enough, but this helped balance the survivability back above the curve as well. Then we're also going to be grabbing Smoke Grenade, which has been buffed this season, as well as an enhancement for a debuff placed on enemies hit by this skill that makes them take more damage from you for 5 seconds. Then countering Smoke Grenade to reduce the cooldown of the skill by 5 seconds if it hits a boss or an elite enemy. And a fun thing to note with this is it is per boss or elite enemy that the skill hits, so any boss fight that has multiple bosses beside each other, like the Fell Council and the Infernal Hordes, or if there are just ever 2 elites on top of each other in combat, if you throw a Smoke Grenade on top of them, it will reduce it by 5 seconds for each of these enemies. So with my current numbers, if I hit 2 elites, I get Smoke Grenade back immediately, which is a fun bit of extra knowledge just to have. That said, one of our ideal gear breakpoints is tempering Smoke Grenade cooldown reduction, at least enough to bring it down to 10 seconds. That makes it so against singular bosses or singular elites, you throw the grenade, it reduces its own cooldown by 5 seconds, the effect lasts for 5 seconds, and then by the time that's over, you can then throw it again to reapply the bonus damage immediately. Past that, we also get a number of passives in this cluster too, 3 ranks of the Agile passive for 12% increased dodge chance after using a cooldown skill, which we actually have quite a few of these, so we use it quite often. We then also grab 1 rank of Exploit, which gives us bonus damage to healthy and injured enemies, mostly though just to give us 3 ranks of the Malice passive for a bunch of bonus damage to vulnerable enemies as well as knocked down enemies, applying both of these bonuses simultaneously so they stack if you have both occurring at the same time. This is where I mentioned specifically partly because of this passive, you can use a variation of this build with the Wind Force unique, the one that is specific to Barrage, and it will give you a decent chance to knock enemies down and double Barrage's damage, but the unique bow that we use instead is simply way better in comparison with the way that the actual numbers work behind the scenes right now. If you have one of these and not the other though, it's just not the end of the world by any means if you have to use Wind Force for this, it's still a damage boost. That said, let's move to our imbuement skills, and here we're going to be taking Cold Imbuement to actually turn the damage of our attacks with this active to cold damage and make them apply chill, as well as the enhancement for this, and then also mixed Cold Imbuement to make cold imbued skills do even more damage to chilled and especially frozen enemies. Then we're going to be taking 3 ranks of the Frigid Finesse passive for bonus damage against chilled enemies, again doubled against frozen enemies. Part of our setup is just stacking an ungodly amount of cold imbuements per cast. I have 7 in my current version, but you can get a fair amount higher than that, honestly, and the idea is that we can spam cold arrows into chilled and frozen enemies, and while you might think that that is bad against bosses, not only is our general boss damage pretty solid due to one of our other build chases later on, but importantly, this means that we apply ridiculous amounts of stagger to bosses because of all this chill buildup, which when it enters their stun mode will then trigger all of our crowd-controlled enemy buffs at the same time for a massive period of burst damage while the boss just can't move. So it's still pretty solid, if not the fastest bossing build specifically for Rogue. Worth mentioning though, this changes once Umbra Crux, the unique that I mentioned earlier, is working, because if you get a good roll of that unique dagger, sending Barrage into an Umbra Crux totem is really good for single target damage increase for this build. All that said, let's move move to our final proper cluster, and here we are only taking a few passives, 1 rank of Innervation for lucky hit energy gain, simple as that. Then 3 ranks of Second Wind for 45% of your maximum life as a barrier every time that you spend 100 energy. This significantly helps boost our tankiness in this build, at least once you reach the higher attack speed spammier version of this build, which can actually sustain this buff and keep it active most of the time. We also then take 1 rank of Adrenaline Rush for some bonus energy regen while moving, but mostly to let us put 2 ranks into Haste for some bonus attack speed while at low energy, which is great, or alternatively bonus move speed while at high energy, which is, well, also great, and this being both makes it adaptable as well. It's worth mentioning as well, if you're doing content where you aren't feeling threatened, like I mentioned earlier with the Dark Shroud change, you could get rid of Second Wind and Innervation, instead put 1 more rank into Haste, 2 more ranks into Exploit, and then put the 1 last rank into here, in 1 rank of Stutter Step, just for a little bit of bonus move speed because you can. That said, finally, our last point is going to be in the key passive, and right now, the way things are working, pretty much without a doubt, you're going to be wanting to go with Precision. This applies a stacking buff when you hit an enemy with a marksman skill, twice as quickly if the hit is a crit, and we hit and crit very frequently. On full stacks, your next Barrage cast is a guaranteed 100% crit, as well as having a 50% bonus crit damage multiplier. The damage of this, though, is even further increased by 15% of our general crit damage bonus, which we do stack extremely high. I've got around 1500% crit damage bonus while not in combat in my current gear. It skyrockets even harder than that mid-fight, though, and a fun further part of this passive is because it applies as a buff, boosting your next core skill damage by a 50% crit damage multiplier. This seems to take effect underneath the secondary bonus of the same effect. Put simply, with the numbers that you see here, assuming no other change, in actuality the number at the bottom should be 417.6%, because it is also being boosted by that 50% bonus from the stacks being full to begin with. So put simply, crit damage is really good. The double dipping for Rogue right now on Precision is insane, not to mention that it's stacked with the extra sort of multiplier-y stuff with trick attacks, so crit damage just scales to the moon right now. That said, skill points are now covered, so just to reiterate, because I know some people just sort of skip that part and will ask in the comments and be confused, Dark Shroud is not going to be on your bar. I know we have 7 active skills selected, we have points in 7 different ones, but there are 6 other ones on your bar that are not Dark Shroud because it is triggered passively by a legendary. Simple as that. Moving on then to our specialization. For this, it's just going to be combo points. It makes the most sense for a good number of different reasons, probably the most important ones being that Barrage's combo point scaler is that it gains more arrows, which means more hits per cast, more ricochets, more crits. Everything that we really want from Barrage gets boosted by having more arrows. And it also lets us use a very solid replacement for the Umbra Crux dagger while it's out of business, which is going to be Condemnation, which we'll talk about in a moment. So let's talk about gear, starting with our legendaries and our uniques. My gear in this setup, in this footage, is not perfect yet by any means. I pretty much just hit level 100 very recently before recording this, but in some ways that may actually help you more than just showing you the perfect setup, as you can see the sort of steps that I've taken along the way to make the journey smoother to get to the ideal gear. That said, starting with uniques, we have the Skyhunter Bow. This is incredibly good for so many reasons now after the buffs in Season 5. The actual effect itself stacks onto Precision, being a bit weird, so this will boost the double dip damage even further, as well as giving us tons of energy gain as we trigger the proc a hell of a lot, not to mention the guaranteed crits on the first hit of an enemy, giving us stacks even quicker as well. And on top of that, once we dive into the actual affixes of the weapon, being a bow that actually has a ridiculously high crit damage implicit affix, unique to this unique, a very high crit damage regular affix as well, attack speed, which is fantastic for this build too, and then a neat specific part being chance for bonus projectiles with all marksman skills, meaning this counts not just for Barrage in our setup, but for Puncture as well, and as a result, this means that we build precision stacks even faster by having Puncture occasionally double cast too. On top of that, because this is chance for bonus projectiles from marksman skills, we also get chance for bonus projectile from Barrage, specifically on our non-unique weapon, and due to these actually being technically separate affixes because they are called a different thing and they have technically different effects behind the scenes, rather than sticking the chance on top of each other so that you would have both of them combined, it's actually separate rolls, meaning if they happen to both proc when you cast a skill, you get 3 rounds of arrows from a cast of Barrage, not just 2, which is just a pretty cool extra overlap worth mentioning here. That said, that's just one of our items, so let's keep going a bit. The Condemnation Dagger is awesome for combo points, especially after it's buffed this season. 50% for basic skill to trigger 3 combo points means that you can pretty consistently use a core skill after 1 or 2 basic skill casts at most, rather than ever having to cast 3 for the full combo point bonus. It also gives a good chunk of bonus damage per combo point spent as a bonus as well. One thing that is worth diving into here, though, is the replacement for this that I would probably use, especially for boss-related content, once things are actually fixed, which is the Umbercrux unique dagger, new this season. This gives you a totem that places on the ground whenever you use a subterfuge skill, and then you can cast Barrage into the totem to do the damage that you put into it to surrounding enemies. But because of the way the Barrage works, with branching volleys, the aspect that we use to increase its damage, it actually makes the ricochets do more damage than the basic arrow hits. So the fact that you can put them into the totem so that the ricochets will actually hit bosses makes it extremely strong for increasing our single target damage within this setup. That said, it's literally not working at the time of this video's release, but once it is a consideration and a variation of this build to replace Condemnation with Umbercrux. That said, next up we have sort of a wild card. This isn't necessary at all to make the build work, but it's something that I used for a lot of my leveling journey once I found it to actually smooth out my journey a bit, which is actually Rakanoth's Wake. These cause an explosion around you when casting a skill with a cooldown, which is neat, but that's not the reason that I was wearing them. That would be because they have cooldown reduction on boots, which is an awesome affix to have, movement speed, which is great too, non-physical damage boost, so bonus damage to all of our cold imbued skills, which is lovely as well. Then the big important one for your first experiences in World Tier 3 and 4, a high roll of all element resist. The main barriers for surviving in World Tier 4 to begin with are armor for physical damage and elemental resistances for elemental damage. Even with other defensives, you just won't survive very easily without those two base things running under it. Up to 35% all resist from your boot slot is a massive boost to your early resistances, especially in the early stages when you cannot craft the highest tiers of gems and don't have your full Paragon board set up either. This becomes entirely unnecessary once the rest of your gear gets better around them. That's why I'm not wearing them anymore, even though I was in some of this footage, but they are an awesome leveling tool if you find them before your gear is sorted out. Otherwise, instead you would want the Frostbitten utility legendary aspect on a regular pair of boots, which gives you a good chunk of bonus critical strike damage multiplier to frozen or stunned enemies, and this is just the ideal use of this slot offensively when min-maxed properly for the rest of your gear. Then we have our other legendary aspects. On your amulet for 50% bonus to effectiveness is going to be branching volleys for the actually increased damage on the ricocheted barrage arrows to make them actually do more damage than the initial shot, at least on higher rolls of the aspect. Also, you have a chance for each of these ricochets to split off into 2 arrows instead of 1, which obviously increases the damage even more for AoE. Then after that, we're going to be getting the high velocity aspect to make every barrage arrow also pierce 1 time on an enemy, making the AoE of the skills far better, as well as importantly increasing the attack speed of specifically Barrage, which is pretty cool too. Then we have the cold clip aspect as well, causing your basic skills to always count as cold imbued, which is great for our setup, and also giving us bonus damage against chilled or frozen enemies, which is one of the main points of our build. Then we have our slight adjustment that makes bosses a friendlier experience within the setup, which is the use of arrow storms, specifically through the vengeful aspect for a lucky hit chance when hitting vulnerable enemies to spawn an arrow storm. This also increases general arrow storm damage by up to 60%, as well as the aspect of arrow storms over here on our gloves for a lucky hit chance with marksman or cutthroat skills to spawn more arrow storms, as well as boosting all arrow storm damage again by a further up to 60%. These generally do more damage in Season 5, they were buffed, the arrow storms themselves, and also they made it so that you're just able to spawn more of them at a time now than we used to be able to do. And once you get multiple arrow storms on top of each other, which is quite easy on a boss, they really start to just add up. Not to mention that you can do this when the boss gets staggered from all of our CC effects too, which is also our main burst damage period. Then finally we have our defensive aspects as well, the Umbrous aspect for lucky hit on crits to spawn a Dark Shroud Shadow. Its companion as well for this is the Enshrouding aspect, which makes healing potions spawn a free Dark Shroud Shadow, as well as making every shadow that you have reduce incoming damage by up to 4% more. They reduce damage by 8% to base, so 4% more per shadow is actually quite a significant gain. My roll is a bit low, so you could have much more damage reduction than I do if you got a better roll. Then for our last one, the of course aspect of Might for a 20% damage reduction after using a basic skill. We are in a combo point setup in this build, so we are just constantly throwing out basic skills, and so this is just going to be always active. That's all of my aspects then, but now we should talk about the stats themselves for every one of your slots. For your non-unique weapon, a sword is actually better than a dagger. My dagger was just that much better than any of my sword options, and the ideal affixes are going to be dexterity, maximum life, and crit damage, with crit damage being the priority of the 3 to have on maximum rolls. For tempering on weapons, you want barrage bonus projectile chance, and then even further crit damage from tempering as well. For your rings, you're going to want crit damage and dexterity, and then attack speed as your actual affixes on them. My rings aren't great, unfortunately. The main thing my current version is lacking is the attack speed part of that I just mentioned, and rings are a great place to get it. For your tempers on rings, though, you want bonus casts of cold imbue, and then also more crit damage. My actual amulet's a better idea of this. My rings aren't perfect, so I just sort of have marksman crit chance on them instead. And then for your amulet, you'll want crit damage and percent dexterity gain, which are both great. And if you get an amulet that happens to have bonus ranks of frigid finesse on it, that is the big jackpot for that slot. For tempers, you also want more cold imbue casts again, and then crit damage, just like this. Yes, we are getting crit damage on every possible slot because it just loops too well into itself within our setup. On which note, for your gloves, you want attack speed, as well as crit damage, and ranks of Barrage, ideally. Specific skill ranks are much harder to come by these days, especially this season, but this has a really big effect on your damage. For tempers, for gloves, you'll want crit damage, of course, and then either smoke grenade cooldown reduction until you reach 10 seconds on your smoke grenade, or lucky hit chance to daze enemies, otherwise to proc trick attacks as a passive more effectively. As for the remaining defensive pieces, you'll want dexterity, dodge chance, maximum life, then armor and resistances, with the last two there being your priority until you have reached the breakpoints for armor resistances. As well, temper onto these pieces as necessary to reach elemental resistance maximums while on your leveling journey, until you actually can get them through other methods or by masterworking the pieces you already have. The reason for this is that you would much rather have better usage of your defensive slots for your actual tempering, but you need to get your resistances sorted as quickly as possible, so this is sort of an ever-shifting beast depending on your own personal stats and your rolls on your gear. That said, what you will almost definitely want is at least one of the percent total armor increase defensive temper rolls. You'll probably want two early on so that you can reach the armor cap, or alternatively you can just have one once you start masterworking it up and making the percentage actually increase the amount that it gives you properly. Of course, all these things will change a little bit with how your stats work and with how your gear is and how your masterworking go, so you just sort of need to adjust this as necessary, but these are the basic concepts. This is your sort of starter version of the endgame setup. For gems and jewelry slots are just for filling in resistance holes as usual. For your weapons, you'll want the emeralds for crit strike damage, of course that's one of the main parts of our build, and then for armor you pretty much always will just want rubies in them for maximum life gain, as maximum life is pretty much the best way that rogues can gain defense from these slots. That is it for gear then, so let's move on to our Paragon board setup within this build. You will notice that I have 8 points unspent here, and that is because I've left a bit of leeway for you to work around your own specific setup and your gear and your rolls. I'll point out the best options for those 8 points along the way, but you'll have to make that choice for yourself. Starting off, when you hit level 50, first you'll want to go up the right side here for the extra damage rare nodes, but once you actually get your gear together, that's worth actually a lot less than just getting the maximum resistance bonus rare nodes, so over time, you will shift this to a left side up. Then you want to take this right to the glyph socket, and inside of this, you want to put the control glyph. This increases the damage that you do to crowd controlled targets, and the secondary effect increases the damage you do to slowed or chilled enemies, or double that effect to stunned or frozen enemies. Considering we apply chill and slow pretty much passively, and stun and frozen very actively and purposefully, these bonuses are active a hell of a lot of the time against smaller enemies, and whenever the boss gets staggered against proper bosses. Past that, you want to get the rare nodes of relevance, get the amount of intelligence that you need to actually activate the secondary bonus, then head up the left side of the board to get to the board attachment gate. On here, you'll want to attach the exploit weakness board with the legendary node itself in the bottom left-hand side comparative to the other spawn locations. Then you want to go up and right to get to the actual glyph socket itself, going through the intelligence node specifically, because in the socket, we're going to put in combat. This increases your critical strike damage for every 5 intelligence purchased in range, but also has the secondary bonus of giving you energy refund on skills that critically strike. So whenever Barrage crits, you get 12% of the energy cost back. That's not a massive amount, but it is a reasonable amount. Though it is worth mentioning that for this specific one, as well as one other glyph in this setup, you will not have the secondary bonus active until you get it to level 15, just because there's not enough intelligence in the range to otherwise. Then we'll be heading up and right, wrapping around to get to the legendary node itself through the damage to elite's rare node, which is quite valuable too. On the legendary node itself then, this gives you a lucky hit chance when hitting a vulnerable enemy to increase your damage. This will stack up to 25% at 25 stacks, and once you reach this point, the bonus will remain for 6 seconds before expiring and resetting. So essentially this is a cycling buff that boosts you in differing amounts based on time and amount of time that you spend fighting enemies. Past that, we have a couple options from this spot on the board for where to spend your bonus points. points if you need cold resistance in your build. Right here, 1, 2, 3, and 4 points spent will get you 30% cold resistance very easily, as well as 2% maximum life. That is high value for 4 points if you need the cold resistance. If you don't, you can use the 4 points elsewhere. Another option for survivability specifically would also be here actually, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for 10% bonus damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. As well, you can get another 2% right here, but that's just a good bit of bonus damage reduction that isn't resistance based if you want that with your remaining points. Then past that, we're going to be moving left here and moving at the left side of the board to attach on the Tricks of the Trade board with the legendary node in the bottom left. From here, you want to head directly left to get through here to get to the glyph socket itself, inside of which we are putting the Fluidity glyph. This boosts the effectiveness of all magic nodes within the range, which mostly here applies to damage to elites, which is actually really good to have 3 of these boosted, because damage to elites is the main thing that you really want in the game. We have so much good AoE damage. Damage to elites counts as damage to bosses, and that's what we really need more of, honestly. That said, the glyph itself will also give you the secondary bonus when activated, where if you cast an agility skill, which for us are Shadow Step, as well as Caltrops, you will deal 10% increased damage and gain 15% energy regeneration for 6 seconds afterwards. So with that, you'll want to actually grab all the dexterity that you need to activate the bonus. You'll want to grab the rare and magic nodes of note. Then what you want to do is wrap around to the legendary node itself on the board, which gives you a 25% increase to marksman skill damage when you use a cutthroat skill, and vice versa. We use Shadow Step, which is a cutthroat skill, more than once every 8 seconds, generally speaking, and so this bonus will always be applied to your puncture and your barrage, which is where most of our damage comes from, so this is quite good. At this point, another stop worth noting to potentially spend your extra point if you are missing some shadow resistance. Right here, 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, 4 point, 5, 6 if you want them, but this is 20% shadow resistance, another 5, so you can fill any holes that you have with shadow resistance with a few points there if that's what you're missing. Then past that, we're going to be heading out of the top side of the board, making sure to stop at critical strike damage here. This rare node, really good. Obviously, we've talked about how good crit damage is for the build, so a crit damage rare node is quite good as well. And again, if you have some spare points and you want them for damage specifically, you would put them in here for crit strike damage, and then here for crit strike damage as well, with a little bit of physical damage along the way, which doesn't help us that much, but you know, it's there. Then we're going to be exiting out the top side of the board, and here we're attaching on the cheap shot board with the legendary node on the bottom side in the middle. We go up the right side here so that we can head through damage reduction from elites, which again is a really high tier defensive node that you definitely want to grab, and then we wrap around immediately to get the legendary node itself, which gives you a stacking 5% increased damage for every nearby enemy that is crowd controlled, up to a maximum of a 25% bonus. And the important part of this is that any staggered boss counts for the maximum bonus of this, which is really useful for stacking with all of our other damage against crowd control, damage against frozen, damage against chilled, all that type of stuff. Past that, then we're going to be going up and left to get the glyph socket itself, inside of which we're going to be putting the Canny glyph. This gives you bonus non-physical damage for every 5 intelligence purchased in the radius, as well as the additional bonus of a stacking debuff on enemies that increases the amount of non-physical damage they take from you every time that you do non-physical damage to them. So the more that we cold imbue, the more damage our cold imbues will do. Then you want to grab the rare and magic nodes of relevance in the radius, as well as the intelligence to activate it, and this is worth noting as our second and final one of our glyphs that will not activate until you have the level 15 version of it from getting your Paragon glyph XP. Past that, you want to head out to the right side of the board first here to attach on the Deadly Ambush board with the legendary node on the bottom side. Here you want to go right and then go actually down to the legendary node first because it's very valuable, which is going to be Deadly Ambush, which is a 23% increased crit damage multiplier to enemies that are within the radius of your Caltrops, specifically for this build. That is very big. Again, crit damage, good crit damage stacking, good crit damage multipliers, very good. All of it stacks under our precision, our trick attacks. It's just lovely. Then we go up and grab the glyph socket itself, inside of which we are putting the Ambush glyph, which increases the damage that you do to enemies that are standing in Caltrops for every 5 strength that you purchase in the radius. And the secondary effects just makes any enemy that's standing in Caltrops take 10% more damage from us, which again is quite good. Then you grab the rare and magic nodes of relevance in the radius, as well as the strength to activate it. Worth noting, before you have this at level 15, you'll need to activate this strength node here to finish it off, but afterwards you can use these ones, which is quite a nice little bonus. And then past that, we just have a couple more boards that we dive into just a little bit, just that tiny bit sticking our foot in to get some extra power. So from back in the cheap shop board, you want to exit out the top side now, and you want to put on the Eldritch Bounty board with the legendary node in the bottom left, and then we go directly there with our points to actually get this legendary node active, because it gives you bonus maximum resistance for cold, which is what we're going to be activating with every time, but it also gives you a 20% increased damage multiplier for that imbuement element after hitting an enemy with an imbued skill for 9 seconds. We have all of our basic skills imbued with Frost. Cold imbuement is our main imbuement in general as well, so just generally you will get a 20% bonus to all cold damage all the time because of this node, so it's basically just an extra damage multiplier that is really quite potent and important to get. Again, this is one of those places where if you have a couple extra points and you want a bit more damage, you could get this one and then this one for extra damage with your imbued skills, as well as extra non-physical damage as well, which is quite good for us too. Then finally, as far as boards go, you want to go back to the Tricks of the Trade board and then go down the bottom side, and here we're going to be attaching on the Cunning Stratagem board with the legendary node in the top right. You're going to want to go right to the legendary node, making a slight stop at the 3% bonus resistance to all elements, which is quite nice. And then once you get to the node itself, it increases the non-damage parts of your combo point bonuses by 33% when you spend 3 combo points. Barrage's combo point bonuses are more damage, which is an effect, but then also bonus arrows, 1 per combo point. So what this does as a node is increases the amount of arrows that Barrage fires by 1. Instead of firing 8 arrows, you fire 9, which is more or less a 12.5% damage multiplier to the entire build. So again, a pretty good use of a legendary node and a pretty good use of a few Paragon points. With that said, this is the point where we've reached here. You got your 8 points, you can spend them where you want, but this is the final part that you actually need to make it properly function well. That then covers the full Paragon board setup, even with a few spare points and options offered to where to actually spend them depending on what your gear leaves you in need of most. With that then, let's just talk about how to actually play this build. If Cold Imbuement is available, cast it. It doesn't have a timer, so you can sit with 7 casts of it waiting to be imbued for as long as you want, and then Shadow Step at least once every 8 seconds, otherwise just for movement purposes and crowd control breaking. Caltrops you mostly want to just use for elites or bosses, larger enemies, because they just sort of take more time to set up than the value they give you when clearing smaller threats. However, if you put your cursor behind where you want to go, and when you cast it, you will actually sort of use it as a tiny movement ability forwards. Essentially, if you turn around before casting it, it will turn the back hop into a front hop purposefully in the direction that you want to go, which is sort of a neat way to use it as a movement skill too. Smoke Grenade you want to use more or less on cooldown, especially if there are elites or bosses in the fight, as they reduce the cooldown of the skill significantly. Then past that, you basically just want to play this essentially as a melee build as far as where you stand, going close range against your enemy, puncture until 3 combo points, which is usually 1 or 2 casts with Condemnation, 3 casts without, obviously. Then you want to use Barrage, simple as that. Some bonus notes as well, remember that your potion is technically a damage increase that lasts for 10 seconds thanks to our passives, and on top of that too, remember that we gain crit chance and crit damage whenever you daze or stun an enemy, so don't be afraid to spam Smoke Grenade a few times if you happen to get 2 elites stacked on top of each other, just to build up that bonus a little bit. That just about does it for today, and everyone. A full guide to the build that I've used to get from level 1 to 100, completing a tier 97 Nightmare dungeon, breeze through tier 4 Infernal hordes, and as you saw and heard from me talking about it, my gear is quite far from the perfect setup that I would ideally have. It's just the point that I happen to be when hitting the max level. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and I know you'll have a good time if you actually choose to use this for yourself in-game. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.